The courtroom doors hadn't even opened yet when whispers started to swirl. Not just whispers, warnings. Rymir Satterthwaite, the young man claiming to be Jay-Z's biological son, was gearing up for a court hearing that could change everything. But behind the scenes, something darker was unfolding. Phone calls, legal threats, influential hands pulling silent strings. What began as a DNA request had now spiraled into a storm of silencing, with one man at the center of it all, -J-Z. Insiders. Claim Team Carter wasn't just playing defense, they were going for total erasure. Media blackouts, sealed files, intimidation moves. And then came the bombshell. Rymir's legal team allegedly received veiled threats just days before the hearing, trying to shut it all down. But Rymir didn't back down. Instead, he stood taller, ready to face not just the courtroom, but a billion-dollar legacy that didn't want him there. This isn't about fame anymore. It's about blood. It's about truth. And it's about how far one of the most powerful men in music will go to stop one young man from proving he belongs. The hearing was just days away when Rymir's team noticed T-mails bouncing, scheduled interviews mysteriously canceled, and one crucial legal document reportedly lost in transit. It wasn't coincidence. It felt like a campaign, a machine, a Carter machine. Lawyers began asking questions behind closed doors. Was someone interfering with due process? The same documents Rymir submitted to force a DNA test had suddenly hit legal roadblocks. As if unseen hands were working overtime to stall justice, and then came the leak. An anonymous tip landed in a journalist's inbox. Jay's. People are trying to bury the kid before the judge sees anything. It was bold, it was raw, but it wasn't unexpected. Rymir had been here before, stonewalled, dismissed, painted as an opportunist. But this time, the world was watching. And thanks to a surprising line other than 50 Cent, the silence was broken. 50 took to social media with a single line. Let that boy speak. It exploded. The post went viral in minutes, forcing national outlets to revisit the case. Rymir was no longer just a whisper in Jay-Z's shadow. He was a headline, backed by a titan unafraid to rattle the empire. The courtroom was silent, thick with tension. No flashing lights, no ROC Nation entourage, just a judge. A boy who had waited nearly his entire life for acknowledgement, and an empire trying to keep the door shut. Rymir sat steady, his hands folded, his eyes locked forward. The court clerk began reading the filings aloud. This wasn't just about DNA anymore. It was about obstruction, was about intimidation, was about a system tilted in favor of those with billions to burn. Jay-Z wasn't in the room, but his presence was. Lawyers representing his interests filed motions to dismiss, questioning jurisdiction, and even Rymir's legal standing. It was clear they weren't just contesting paternity, they were trying to erase the very possibility of accountability. But something shifted. The judge, an older woman with no fear of celebrity, paused midway through and looked over her. Glasses? Why hasn't a test been done? She asked flatly. There was no good answer. The courtroom murmured. Jay's legal team fumbled for words, and Rymir for the first time allowed himself to breathe. That moment, tiny but seismic, signaled something the Carters hadn't counted on. The court was no longer playing by industry rules. Outside, the press gathered like wolves. 50 Cent's posts had opened the gates, and now reporters were tracking timelines, subpoenas, and tracing back years of legal maneuvering. What they found stunned even seasoned journalists. A paper trail that suggested someone somewhere had been fighting hard to prevent the truth from ever surfacing. And for Rymir, the cost had never been fame or fortune, it had always been identity. He didn't want Jay-Z's money. He wanted what was stolen from him in silence, the right to his own name, the truth, and the man who had denied him for decades. They called it a technical delay. Another postponed hearing? Another week Rymir had to sit with the weight of a name he might never claim. But outside the court's chambers, something had cracked. Independent investigators began digging into old files, custody documents, hospital records, and that 2010 family court judgment that mysteriously vanished before it could demand a DNA test. Legal scholars whispered behind closed doors. Was this obstruction or something darker? Rymir's legal team dropped a new filing an emergency petition for DNA. No more delays, no more games. The petition included emails, letters, and sworn affidavits. Names were named. Pressure was building. Even TMZ began hinting at the possibility of perjury. Jay-Z's team responded, not with DNA, but with threats. Cease and desist letters were sent to bloggers, influencers, even attorneys who had commented publicly. One source close to ROC Nation said bluntly, "This kid is playing with fire." But 50 Cent wasn't backing down. He posted again, this time with screenshots, court stamps, and a caption that read, "They can't stop what's coming." Behind the scenes, quiet phone calls turned into loud arguments. Industry insiders started distancing themselves. And a surprising ally emerged, an ex-ROC Nation executive who'd once worked on legal strategy for DJ's private matters. She contacted Rymir's team anonymously, offering one crucial detail. He knew. He's always known. By now, the judge had ordered a sealed review of the original paternity request. What she found was damning, a pattern. A chain of paperwork redirecting Rymir's filings from family court to civil court to appellate. And back again, just enough to stall the request, just enough to frustrate funding, just enough to bury it under process. But now, 'twas bubbling to the surface. The next hearing would not be postponed. Inside the courtroom hallway, Rymir sat with his mother's old Bible. No cameras, no applause. Just a quiet young man carrying 2 decades of hurt, and an ocean of truth waiting to erupt. And somewhere in New York, Jay-Z's legal advisors scrambled. For the first time, the mogul wasn't just fighting a rumor, it was fighting a record. The courtroom was filled with a thick silence, heavy, like the calm before a storm that no one could predict. Reporters lined the gallery in quiet reverence. No cameras were allowed, but that didn't matter. Every seat was taken. This wasn't just about paternity anymore. This was about legacy, power, and a fight against the machinery that protected the untouchable. Rymir walked in first, dressed plainly, flanked by a small legal team that looked both determined and exhausted. But behind their eyes was something more dangerous than rage-proof. Jay-Z wasn't in the room. His attorneys were. T came with thick binders, confident expressions, and the air of men used to winning. But even they seemed to hesitate when the judge entered and took her seat with a solemn nod. "We are here today," she began, "not to debate celebrity, but to ensure that the integrity of the court is not compromised by status." The words echoed. Everyone felt the shift. Then Rymir's attorney stood and addressed the court. He didn't start with an accusation. He started with a timeline. It's a meticulous breakdown of every filing, every denial, every redirect, and every missing form since 2010. Then came the sealed letter from the hospital's archive department, confirming that a DNA test request had once been filed. And mysteriously withdrawn 2 days later, the court went silent. Jay-Z's team objected, but they fumbled. Their motions to strike were overruled. And then came the moment no one expected. The judge agreed to unseal specific documents from the original paternity case. A ripple ran through the room. If those records were as explosive as promised, the game was about to change. Permanently. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. Some held signs that read, "Truth is not defamation." Others held up pictures of Rymir as a child. Next, to a young Sean Carter, the resemblance undeniable. On social media, Deanna Jez was trending worldwide. Celebrities began weighing in, some cautiously, others directly. Meek Mill tweeted, "Everybody deserves the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." But the most shocking post came from Beyoncé's cousin, who shared a cryptic Instagram story, a baby's footprint next to a broken chain. It disappeared in minutes, but screenshots live forever. Back inside, the judge recessed until morning. But the look she gave Jay-Z's lawyers was clear. Time was running out. The court would not stall anymore. Rymir stood on the steps of the courthouse after the hearing. The sun broke through gray clouds overhead. "I didn't come here to ruin anybody," he told reporters. "I just came for the truth. That's all I've ever wanted." And behind the scenes, Jay-Z was already making calls not to deny, but to negotiate. Because for the first time in decades, the myth of invincibility had a crack in it. And through that crack, the light was starting to pour in. The next morning, the crowd outside the courthouse had tripled. It wasn't just news vans anymore, it was people. Parents with kids, law students with notepads, civil rights activists, even a few celebrities in sunglasses trying not to be noticed. Everyone came for one thing: to witness what power looked like when it was finally being forced to answer. Inside, the tension was unbearable. Jay-Z still hadn't appeared in person, and whispers filled the hallway. Was he avoiding the judge? Was he preparing something big? Or was he truly afraid of what might come out? Rymir entered again, but this time he was not alone. His mother was there, aged by stress, but standing tall. She carried with her an old folder, weathered, faded at the edges, and stuffed with forgotten letters and receipts. She was ready to speak. And when the judge returned to the bench, she nodded toward the mother and said, "The court will now hear from the witness." What followed shook the room to its core. She told her story slowly, without theatrics. She spoke of a quiet affair in the early 90s, a man who was just beginning to rise. She described a moment, a pregnancy, and then the silence. Letters that went unanswered, calls ignored. And then, after Rymir was born, a knock at the door, not from Jay, but from someone else. Someone offering money, and a warning she kept. The letter, she read it aloud. "Do not pursue this. It will not go your way." It was signed with a fake name, but the handwriting, she said, was unmistakably his. Jay-Z's lawyers objected. The judge overruled again. Then came the bombshell. A signed affidavit from a former associate who once worked at the law firm that represented Jay-Z in the early 2000s. The affidavit confirmed that internal memos skissed discussing how to contain the situation if the paternity claim ever went public. The associate had kept copies, redacted but real. And with that, the judge turned to Jay-Z's legal team. "Is your client prepared to submit to a court or DNA test?" She asked. The room froze. One of the attorneys stood, hesitated, and finally said, "Your Honor, we respectfully request time to confer with our client." "Denied," the judge replied sharply. "You've had a decade. The time for delays is over. If you will comply, or this court will proceed with contempt proceedings." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Outside, the crowd erupted as word spread. It wasn't official yet, but Jay-Z had just been backed into a legal corner, and people could feel it. The walls of privilege were beginning to buckle that night. Rymir posted a single sentence on his story. "My voice is finally louder than their silence." And in Beverly Hills, Jay-Z made his first direct move in months. He called a meeting with crisis PR lawyers and one unexpected guest, an old music mogul turned political fixer. The question was no longer if this story would go public. The question now was how far Jay was willing to go to stop it. If he finally realized this time he couldn't buy sunrise, the machine was in motion. Jay-Z's crisis team activated a series of legal filings designed to slow the court's momentum. Motions, appeals, confidentiality requests, all layered one after another like armor. It was the kind of legal fog only billionaires could afford to create, but the judge didn't flinch. She scheduled a DNA submission for the following week. No more extensions. No more silence. This time, the truth would have a deadline. Meanwhile, Rymir's life had changed overnight. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Social media flooded with hashtags, Rimy Desert, Visa Truth, Jay's Adutha Test. Public opinion was shifting, not just around Jay-Z's legacy, but around the way power had shielded him for decades. Young black men who grew up on Jay's lyrics were now questioning the man behind the myth. And quietly, music industry insiders began reaching out to Rymir. Some offered support. Others wanted to talk off the record. But one message stood out. It came from a burner account. Then, later, through an encrypted app. It said, "He's trying to make this go away. He's not just scared of being your father. He's scared of what comes with it." Rymir showed it to his legal team. They dug deeper. What they uncovered wasn't just about paternity, was about sealed settlements. Gag orders paid out over the years, and an emerging pattern. Anyone who got too close to exposing Jay-Z's private world either vanished from the conversation or settled into sudden silence. Artists, assistants, even a woman who had once hinted at similar allegations. Gone, scrubbed. And then it happened. A leak. An anonymous Dropbox folder began circulating in activist journalist circles. Inside, pages of emails, private legal memos, and one particularly damning documented draft. NDA prepared for a known associate of Sean Carter in the late 2000s. The associate, Rymir's mother. The NDA had never been signed. But it was proof someone in DA's orbit had tried to bury this long before the courts got involved. The media seized it. TMZ posted a redacted version. The Breakfast Club debated it. Even late night, hosts cracked jokes about the most expensive DNA test in history. But for Rymir, it wasn't about trending. It was about preparing for the courtroom. What came after Jay-Z's team? Under Pressure finally released a public statement. It was cold, clinical. It said Jay categorically denies fathering any child outside of his marriage and accused Rymir of seeking attention. But they stopped short of saying he would not take the test. That silence spoke volumes. Beyoncé remained quiet. So did ROC Nation, but inside the label, murmurs grew louder. Some executives whispered that Jay should take the test, clear his name, move on. Others feared what else might come out if he did, because now it wasn't just about one young man. It was about the illusion of control. And when the court date for DNA submission finally arrived, streets outside the courthouse were lined with people holding signs, not just for Rymir, but for every case like his that never made it this far. Inside, under flashing cameras, Jay-Z still did not appear. But a sample was submitted under seal, under pressure. Under history's eye, the story wasn't over. It was just finally real. The days following the DNA submission felt like standing on the edge of a storm, knowing thunder was coming but not knowing from which direction. Rymir tried to live normally, waking up, eating breakfast, staying offline, but the world wouldn't let him. His name was now part of a national conversation. Everyone had an opinion. Some defended Jay-Z, claiming Rymir was chasing clout. Others called it justice delayed. But in between the noise was something deeper: questions about legacy, about fatherhood, about what it means when truth is treated like a threat. And then came the silence. The court, having received both samples, issued a formal hold on all external discussion. No statements, no leaks, nothing until results were finalized. But behind that wall, movement stirred. The lab, one of the most reputable in the country, had been under scrutiny before the first vial was opened. Journalists filed FOIA requests, trying to trace who was paying for what. And then one lab employee, anonymously, dropped a message to a legal watchdog site. Something about this feels bigger than DNA. It rattled Rymir's legal team. They knew what it meant. There was pressure, corporate, legal, even political. It could influence what was supposed to be science. So they acted. Rymir's lawyer filed for a court-appointed forensic observer, demanding transparency at every step. The judge agreed. Meanwhile, Jay-Z's team went quiet. No interviews, no legal moves. It's just a chilling silence as if bracing for impact. And people started noticing. ROC Nation artists stopped tagging Jay. In posts, his usual defenders on Twitter were nowhere to be found. It was like watching a giant slowly step back into the shadows. Hoping silence might become invisibility. But silence didn't stop the momentum. A podcast episode featuring Rymir's aunt went viral. She spoke softly, emotionally, recounting how Rymir's mother cried after every letter returned unopened from Jay's camp. She didn't want money, the aunt said. She just wanted acknowledgement. Just a yes or a no. That's it. Then came a whistleblower, a former paralegal from New York. Firm connected to Jay-Z's longtime lawyer reached out to an investigative journalist. They alleged that early drafts of paternity settlement agreements were crafted years ago, never signed, never acted on. They described strategy meetings where the goal was to let time kill the story. It didn't work, because time, this time, had worked for Rymir. Then finally, without warning, the envelope arrived, stamped confidential, delivered to both legal teams. Inside one result. One sentence. And as the judge read it silently from the bench, a shift happened. No gasps, no shouting. Just a tightening of breath across the courtroom. And then the judge looked up. She didn't read the result aloud. She said only this: a full hearing will be held. All parties are to appear in person. The result is admissible. And it changes. The nature of this case, KC would have to come face to face with Rymir. The story could no longer be managed through lawyers or silenced by wealth. It was moving into the open, and everyone was watching.